It's early. Needs to be tilted a little bit. Oh, dark. We can do that. Oh, well, the lights are not.
Yeah.
I checked the requirements and I'm pretty sure it said 2 credit contracts. I don't know. I just followed. Yes. I just didn't do it. So I credit No, I really it's worse now. What?
Cars like when you're angry, or like when somebody when you're in a hard place. It's maybe it's kind of about honestly, I don't know. Like when I'm not or something. So I think it's like that part. And like, my glasses.
I'll never wear it again.
So weird. That would make me cry.
Yeah, I don't think
Yeah. That's a great action.
Yeah, the big slip.
They look no, but like it was like it's like no, it's like stop. Where did you guys hear? That's just what
See, the reason I didn't go was because I was using this time to finish
I'm sorry, your place. I have to leave. I gotta go. I'm so sorry. I like was driving from.
Might be one of those situations.
It's all yours. All give me a little bow tie. Are you eating this week? I do. Okay. I mean, just like I'll be here tomorrow. Okay.
Like what we discussed, I remember what I said. Basically, cramp, James and I. He chose where we sat, so I was saying. Seems like enough time.
Okay, hello folks. Welcome to our last Prout reading of the year. Congratulations all you got here. Anyways, it's been a pleasure being the instructor for this class. It's a strange experience because I don't have many personal interactions with you all, but I have enjoyed being here. And if you have any questions about Prout and the required readings, where you are with that, feel free to send me an email at any point. A reminder that the makeup portfolio, which you only need to do if you didn't go to the required number of readings that you needed to do for Prout. And again, if you're unsure about that, feel free to send me an email. I'll look at my Excel spreadsheet for you. That is due midnight on the 28th, but you can turn it in at any time. And I've seen a lot of people have started to turn those in, and they've been very interesting to read. So feel free to get that done whenever it works for your schedule. Just get it in by the 28th at midnight. And again, thank you all for being here. And I'm going to invite Mike up to invite our readers.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Yes, I'm Mike Schultz. I'm teaching the thesis class for the majority of, well, at least the last two of our readers tonight. We have three. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first writer, Jake Schilling. Jake is from, oh, you can clap, go ahead. Hell yeah! That's the last one. Clap for whatever you want, everything. Jake is from White House, Ohio, and enjoys MMORPGs, cosplay, and attending Ren festivals in the fall. He also loves Star Wars, like a lot. So may the force be with you tonight. Hearing these interests, it may come as no surprise that Jake's stories exist in other worlds. Call it fantasy, call it science fiction, call it whatever type of story you want, but know that Jake strives to write stories that people can see themselves in, specifically queer and trans people. And he succeeds. Jake says he's invested in creating imperfect characters. And through these imperfections, we're able to find bits and pieces of ourselves. Whether it's someone who is literally unable to exist in their own skin, or a synth mechanic seeking revenge for a lost love, Jake's characters embody the most human of emotions. The fact that these characters live in other worlds makes them all the more real, right? When I asked Jake what the best thing was that happened during his BFA experience, he said, "The gay dinosaur wedding freshman year." And I said, "What?" So, context. Apparently one day when campus preachers showed up, Jake grabbed his inflatable T-Rex costume out of his trunk. Yes, he keeps an inflatable T-Rex costume in his trunk. And for those of you here last week, that makes 2 soon-to-be graduating BFAs who have owned inflatable T-Rex costumes. Like, it makes me think, like, was that like part of like the going to college package? Like, I don't know. Anyway, there apparently was a 3rd T-Rex, if we're keeping count, as well, because Jake encountered another one in the crowd by the preacher, and someone else dressed as a wizard, I believe, promptly married the 2 carnivores in front of the gathered masses, like gay dinosaur wedding, like legit. So, and much like the crowd cheering for the newlywed dinosaurs, Jake's advice for future BFAs is to not doubt yourself too much and to remember that everyone is rooting for you, whether you own an inflatable T-Rex costume or not. All right, so please help me welcome and root for Jake Schilling.
Jesus Christ. Sorry, Jesus. Hi, everybody. Can everybody just like say hi so it doesn't feel like everybody's just saying hi?
Hi, Jake.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Ryan. Actually, that made it so much better. Thank you. So, as I'm sure you can tell, I'm very, very anxious. Probably like top 10 worst fears ever. But we're gonna do it. Like, we're up here, and it's gonna happen right now. So, this piece actually was born last semester, which should perhaps come as no surprise to anyone who's heard me bemoaning the fact that I've had writer's block the entire time I've tried to work on my thesis. But even before that, I've had trouble kind of germinating ideas that I really want to go after. And this piece was different. I was driving home from the Ren Fair, and I had a piece due that Monday, and I kind of this character just popped in my head. Like, his face and his name, and it's kind of a really obscure name, and his story. So I was like, this is important, and maybe I should write you and have you be alive. So, and this character is very near and dear to me. He's awful, but I do feel a sense of kinship with him, specifically when it comes to his feelings regarding his self and his body. I would like to think hopefully I'm less violent than this character, which is a good segue into the fact that there is some violence in this piece. There is some body horror, so if those are things that you're not into, be aware. So now without further ado, because if I don't start now, I will never start. This is What's Yours is Mine. When Melrose first saw the skin upon his forearm begin to splinter, he was standing knee-deep within the swamp, fingers pinched around a cattail reed he was meant to pick. At first, he tried to ignore it, to pass it off as a trick of the red sunlight spilling onto the pitch-black surface, which swirled lethargically around the stalks of his legs. As he snapped the reed between his fingers and straightened, however, it became no longer possible to pretend he hadn't seen it at all. Clear as day, the pale expanse of skin had begun to flake like parchment, peeling back from his arm far enough to reveal the ashiness beneath. Melrose stilled. Surely it was too soon. He sank his teeth into the soft skin of his cheek. His first mistake is when he released his jaw. The squishy flesh hung loosely within his mouth as though it had been sliced away. He muttered a low curse beneath his breath, straightening up and stuffing the thin handful of weeds into his satchel. The thick water sloshed beneath his feet as he waded from the marsh, trying to move as tenderly as possible. It was paramount that he not disturb his shifting body any more than he already had. The sun swayed lower in the sky, a great bloody eye that scrutinized the water, the trees, and the dark, small figure making its way into the woods, and submerged them all in crimson. As he swung open the door to the cabin, the nail on his ring finger swayed as if hung by a thread. It fell away uselessly a moment later. He stared in silence down towards the floorboards, the corner of his upper lip twisting in some weak manner of disgust, before he slipped inside. In his absence, autumn's chill had wedged its talons between the slats of the cottage, crisp and stiff. Not even the trio of fat-dripping candles spilling over the nightstand could drive out the sensation, which, despite the cloak wrapped around his shoulders, made its home now in the cavern of his chest. He tossed his basket aside with a grunt, slowing to a stop in front of the tall mirror that stood a few feet from the foot of his unmade bed. He scratched at the area of exposed gray skin on his forearm, a bad habit. Another nail, this one, the index on his opposite hand, slid off of his finger and onto the ground. It had happened earlier than he anticipated it would, much earlier. The man had been a hunter, far enough removed from society that it was likely no one would come looking for him. Melrose had pressed himself flush against the trunk of an aging oak as the man stalked through the forest, bow drawn. There was that moment of hesitation, as there always was, the fear that perhaps this would be his end instead of his quarry's. He recalled the distant faces of his protectors, hazy and worn over the course of many years, the arms that kept him close and safe, waxing cold and lifeless, and he struck. His descent was quiet, careful, and quick, all at once. The pads of his fingers pressed into the thick, pulsing vein that strained in the hunter's neck, his nails meeting at the notch beneath his throat, and he twisted. Crack. Thud. He hadn't known his name, nor from whence he came, but he could recall vividly the rough timbre of his voice, the calluses on his palms, the ragged edges of his nails which tore into his skin. He always remembered them. Melrose's gaze shifted to the piece of parchment that lay on the table to his right, nestled amongst an assortment of jars. He knew, even without looking, but there was some part of him that wished desperately to be proven wrong. Neatly drawn in ink was a schedule of the phases of the moon, charcoaled through once they had passed. The new moon came tomorrow. He had one day to renew himself. Melrose swore, running a shaking hand through his wavy locks of hair. A few thick, mousy brown strands floated languidly to the floor. He stumbled to the counter, reaching out for a tall, long-necked bottle. The pale skin on the back of his hand grew taut and then promptly split into a complex network of gashes, revealing more of his own skin, which, despite his greatest efforts and experiments with alchemy, always remained gray once his host body deteriorated. The only blessing, there was no blood to be seen. These were not injuries, not as much as they were the shedding of one skin for another. Melrose had their bodies only for as long as they would have naturally lived. That was fate's decree. He wondered how the hunter might have died. Plague, bandits, a wild animal. These were the thoughts that tumbled uselessly through his head as he brought the glass to his lips, the bottom of which had split down the middle.
Wondering did nothing but serve as a distraction, and yet perhaps there was some sort of therapeutic value to it, some relief from the worm of guilt that informed him he was wrong to kill and to survive, which for him were two sides of the same coin. Death took as it wished. He then was just an instrument in a process that was ultimately inevitable either way. He emptied the gin down his throat and made his way back to the table, unrolling a spool of gauze with his undamaged hand. Mercifully, the man he inhabited had a network of thin scars running along his face, accompanied by a broken nose, never properly healed. It would not be a stretch of the imagination to assume he'd run into some sort of trouble. Miller's wrapped his opposite hand, readjusting the heavy cloak around his shoulders. He stepped back towards the door, reaching for the satchel that hung from a nail on the back. As he did, he felt something dislodge itself in the back of his mouth. He spat out a wayward molar which fell with a minuscule clatter, almost like a marble, onto the wooden floor. It was the nature of his kind to live on borrowed time. He needed to find more. It was a short trek on horseback to Hound's Run, which is a place slightly west of the major trade routes that ran across the continent. It was small and gray, but large enough for a respectable inn and a smattering of merchant stalls. He had been here before, only when he had to, when food was scarce or he was in need of supplies. And yet each time he felt alien, displaced. No one looked towards him. The few people that remained in the street were busy running errands or talking quietly amongst themselves. Still, Mellors was plagued by paranoia. There was a sense of wrongness about him, within him, made worse as he had begun to deteriorate into his true self. He tugged the cloak tighter around himself, securing his hood before his gaze fell to the entrance of the inn. Warm light spilled from the doorway, enticing him closer despite his instinct to turn and flee. Surely, if he were to find someone anywhere, it would be within. Mellors inhaled and stepped forth, legs shaking as he made his way up to the path. As he entered, he was met immediately by the low buzz of conversation and the occasional peal of laughter cutting through the smell of booze and smoke. It was well lit and warm. A fire blazed brightly in the hearth, and there, sitting pristinely on the worn counter, were 2 crisp loaves of bread. He stood upon the threshold for a moment, struck by a pang of uncertainty, and then slowly made his way inside, adjusting the clasp on his cloak. A plump woman bustled about behind the counter, flitting back and forth with frothy mugs of ale. He eyed the stools, agonizing over whether or not to sit. There was only one other figure there, with his head turned towards the fire. Eventually, Mellors took the stool furthest to the left, 2 seats away from the solitary patron. The bartender stepped over, regarding his broad shoulders with interest. "What'll you be having then, sir?" Mellors cleared his throat, a sound that felt much louder to him than it likely was in actuality. He raised a large hand, one which now felt cumbersome in comparison to his own, and gestured down the counter. "Bread." The madam nodded, promptly moving back down the counter. As he spoke, the figure 2 seats down turned his head to regard him curiously. As their eyes met, Mellors almost thought he'd be sick. A sudden wave of fever washed over him, culminating in the pit of his stomach, hot and acidic. It took him a moment to triangulate the feeling. Delirious envy and desire so discomforting it made him feel like he was crawling out of his skin again. He had eyes like mid-spring grasses and a peppering of freckles across the bridge of his nose. Dark locks of hair fell to rest just above his eyes, and his lips turned slightly upwards at the left corner, as though he were somehow perpetually inquisitive. As Mel stared, the stranger's smile widened. "Hello," he said. His voice was soft and rich and gentle, and it was enough to make the shape changer across from him sick to his stomach. It had to be him. "Hello," Mellors rasped in response. It felt as though hundreds of needles were pressing into the back of his neck. The innkeeper shuffled back over, depositing one of the fresh loaves in front of him. Numbly, he fished around for his coin and slid it across the counter. The man across from him, though he was truly little more than a boy, looked on, seemingly amused. "I haven't seen you around here before." Melrose slowly shook his head. No, I live a ways from town. Ah. The man took a sip of his drink. It was all Melrose could do not to start staring at him again. He feared that if he did, he would no longer be able to rip his eyes away. So do I, actually. It's the farm a few miles from here. He smiled sheepishly, his lips trying to reveal a flash of white teeth. I just came here to sell the eggs and dairy. Melrose allowed himself another glance, just a side glance. He couldn't trust himself with looking at him directly. He tried a smile of his own, which felt artificial, unnatural. His companion didn't seem to notice. A farmer? You don't look like a farmer. The stranger grinned. This was funny, somehow. No? What do you look like, exactly? Melrose raised his broad shoulders. Some sort of royal? A knight, maybe? He chuckled. I'm too poor to be a knight or royal. He hated the stranger's laughter, and yet, at the same time, he wanted to hear more. It was akin to the feeling he imagined ensnared the men he sometimes saw at the edges of town, begging for a drop of beer from passerby, a morbid, strange obsession. He loved it. He hated it. He wanted it. Mel managed another smile. This one felt a little less like his mouth was being stretched wide open. He looked back down at his loaf of bread. What's your name? He ventured cautiously, regretting saying it almost as soon as the words left his lips. Elias. Elias. He gave it to him freely, effortlessly, with a little lean forward and a friendly smile. Yours? Amos. That had been the name of someone, somewhere. Elias nodded. He smiled again. It's good to meet you, Amos. I don't know many locals, believe it or not. Melrose chuckled as though he were in pain. He reached for his bread, the warmth seeped into his hand as he wrapped it in his paper and string, inhaling through his nose again in an attempt to calm himself. No? You seem friendly enough. I don't get out much. Elias paused. Usually, the cows and sheep need watching, and occasionally there's a pig to slaughter and bring to the butcher, and since my father passed, I'm in charge of the estate. Melrose slowly pushed himself to his feet, sliding the loaf of bread into his satchel. His stomach was still churning angrily, and his brain felt as though it was being sloshed about in his skull. It was a bit like drunkenness, he thought to himself. Maybe if he could put some distance between them, he would be able to breathe properly again. He needed to think. He needed to plan. Elias looked on, bemused. Oh, I'm sorry. Are you leaving? I didn't mean to keep you. Melrose nodded and then shook his head. No, that's all right. I was going to. The words died in his throat as he turned to look at him again, exhaling sharply. The question spilled out of his lips almost before he knew he was speaking. Do you like mulberry gin? You could see the surprise flicker through Elias's eyes, followed by disbelief and finally hope. Yes, I do, he stammered, smiling hesitantly. Melrose smiled back, horrified, delirious, exhilarated. His face felt like it was made of stone. Do you ever get lonely out here? All by yourself? Elise's voice was warm, kind. He sat in the chair near the counter and leaned forward to rest his elbows on his knees. Part of Melrose wished he hadn't followed him back, though he knew not bringing him when he had so little time was suicide. Sometimes, he told him, it was the truth. I don't know that I notice it anymore. That was a lie. He had been solitary nearly all of his life. There was no comfort in it. Melrose unsteadily poured 2 glasses of gin. One he handed away. Elise's fingers were warm as he accepted it. His touch was nearly painful. Do you want... Melrose began, inhaling slowly to steady himself. For a moment he allowed himself to consider it Elise's wants. Did he desire something more than laboring away in pigsties until he was old and brittle? Did he spend his days wondering what life might entail for one of those men with twisted faces who rode through town on horseback, the grooves in their skin, those wordless stories of valor and service to kings or gods or money? Was he lonely? Melrose gestured to the wrapped loaf of bread from the tavern. Elias smiled. He nodded. Please. Briefly, the shapeshifter was visited by the painful twist in his stomach. He wished he was human. He wished he could care about what Elias wanted. He wished. He wished. Melros's hand shook as he reached for the dagger on the counter. He could feel himself coming undone. It wouldn't be long now to the eye of human rose, cementing him forever in a body that was foreign, twisted, warped, wrong. Elias sat behind him now, cradling his glass in his lap. He had to act. He had to. A beat of silence passed. Elias shifted in his seat. His eyes had turned towards the jars on the table, the small collection of human-looking teeth. What's this? Melrose turned and plunged the knife into his stomach. Elias gasped. There was a moment of silence devoid of breath. Melrose could feel the warmth of the other man's body against the side of his fist as he drove the weapon into his flesh. Elias coughed wetly, and then his hands flew to Melrose's arm. His fingernails dug into muscle. Long, thin gashes of flesh tore away beneath the beds of his nails, revealing the discolored gray skin underneath. Elias cried out in shock, instinctively jerking his arm away. Melrose pushed further, clenching his teeth as he twisted the knife. Wet heat bloomed beneath his grip as a ragged circle of red spread slowly outwards from Elias' midsection, staining the worn fabric of his tunic. Elias fell back on the mattress, his chest heaving as his hands frantically sought out the knife buried in his stomach. Melrose panted raggedly on top of him, and his vision grew and focused as the pigment in his iris began to seal away. Elias grabbed his arm. Melrose made the mistake of glancing downwards, ensnaring himself in Elias's eyes, wide summer green and bulging slightly outwards, tears threatening to leak from the edges. Please, he choked, shuddering as he stared up at him. Melrose buried his teeth into his lower lip, turning his head roughly to the side as though he were unable to look upon his own sin. I'm sorry, he whispered, the confession tearing itself from his throat. It became his mantra as Elias writhed beneath him. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Eventually, Elias's movements slowed. He shuddered once, violently, and then Melrose felt him relax beneath him, a final sigh escaping past his lips. Melrose collapsed on top of him. A guttural groan escaped him, a sound like a wounded animal. His hands flew to his face, fingers digging into his peeling skin, and his eyes grew unfocused once more. Ragged sobs shook his beleaguered body. A flood of tears, torturous and hot, dripped down the bridge of his nose and onto the mattress. When he recovered long enough to see, he was met by the pale specter of Elias's once warm face, lively eyes that had grown glassy and cold. Melrose slid from the mattress and stumbled unsteadily towards the door, thrusting it open before heaving violently onto the threshold. Yes, he could still feel pain. When he had finished emptying what little contents of his stomach remained, he straightened up. The moon was gazing at him from the black sky, slowly rising to its peak above the trees. Melrose stumbled back inside. He looked haphazardly down towards his arm where Elias had torn away his flesh. A few more fingernails had slid from the tips of his fingers, revealing the gray that lay beneath. Out of the corner of his eye, he spied himself in the mirror once more, nearly returned to his raw state. Pale gray skin, messy locks of short, white hair, and large, foolishly white eyes. Long nails had sprouted from the soft beds on every finger. He hated to look, and yet he always did, studying over the bony, thin expanse of his body with something between morbid obsession and disgust. He tore at the skin of his cheek in desperation, as if somehow he could tear this layer away like the rest and be surprised by something new beneath. It stung in response. This was his body. His body. Not borrowed or taken. He tore away his gaze and turned to where Elias lay, Swallowing down the urge to be sick once more, he stepped back to the foot of the bed, and it was twisting painfully. I'm sorry. Melrose reached out a hand and pressed his palm against Eliza's still cooling forehead. He remembered the soft timbre of his voice, the creases at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the soft waves of his hair. His jaw slipped out of place with a dull crack and then repositioned. His nasal bone followed. His neck thickened, then his arms, his chest, his thighs. Curls of hair tumbled down to the nape of his neck. When he opened his eyes again, they were a tender springtime green, and he was the image of the man lying dead on the bed before him. It had always been quicker to become someone else than it was to change back. Melrose slept out of necessity. He was new and raw and hurting, and he could not bear to look on Eliza's motionless frame any longer than he already had. He woke sore but perfectly formed, and in lieu of eating, he dragged Eliza's body from the house and further into the forest. It was torturous and morbidly difficult, owing to the fact that he was dragging someone who was now his exact size and weight. There was a patch of yellow flowers amidst the tall forest grasses, and it was in front of them he dug the hole and deposited the body. He remained there for some time, staring down at Elias, whose face looked deceptively serene. He wondered what he had taken from him. He wondered if he could have understood. By the time Melrose had pulled himself from his trance and walked the distance back to his home, the sun had reached its highest point and again begun to sink. The skies tinged a rusty shade of orange, and the insects chirred softly, though their noise could hardly reach him through his haze. He pushed pieces of bread from the night before into his mouth like a person who had forgotten how to eat. The crust tasted like ash against his tongue. He had become uncomfortably aware of his breathing, and he could feel the autumn chill again advancing, slipping inside his nostrils and making a home in the cavern of his chest. He wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep when he woke. The sun no longer shone through the slats in the cottage, and the outside chill had grown into a bitter cold. Melrose grabbed for a pelt that had fallen to the floor, briefly alarmed to see Elias's arm attached to his body. The memory returned, and he curled into himself, shrinking into the topmost corner of the bed and away from the few wayward drops of dry blood that remained unfeigned. Something was wrong. He couldn't place it. There was an unease in the pit of his stomach that demanded his attention. Perhaps it was hunger or a delayed wave of nausea. He pressed his forehead into the cold back of the pillow, and that was when he realized the silence. The insects had ceased their song. Melrose's eyes reopened. Slowly, he gathered himself up into a sit, pushing unsteadily off of the edge of the mattress. It was a silence not unlike the one the night before. He saw his hand once again against Elias's stomach and closed his eyes tightly to his swallow. His hand on the door looked alien once more. He visualized his own flesh beneath his nose. He pushed. The forest lay as black as pitch around him, but there was an anomaly on the horizon far away, a spot of light against the dark. He stared at it without processing. No, not the sun nor the moon. It licked upwards from the ground, growing larger and larger as it consumed. Fire. Fire. Melrose backed away instinctively, though it was some distance from the forest. Nor had it begun in Helm's Run. No, this was too far west. As he watched, he felt an insistent itch on the back of his neck, almost as if he had been stung. Instinctively, he brought a hand to his nape and scratched. His fingers came away with flakes of light brown skin. It's the farm a few miles from here. Melrose's breath caught in his throat. He dropped to his knees and howled with grief as the tongues of flame stretched ever higher in the sky, consuming what once had been Eliza's home. Thank you.
you, Jake. Our next writer tonight is Ryanne Duchene. Ryanne will be reading poems and stories tonight from her thesis titled Super Feeling Safari. Yeah, that sounds cool. According to Ryanne, a super feeling is the combination of emotions with fantastical elements woven together with images that don't coexist in nature. Follow that? Awesome. Her writing pursues these emotions of awesomeness, as she also describes them, with a distinct voice. There are characters, there are metaphors, there are combinations of images and fantasy, all woven together by Ryanne, our tour guide, through the habitat of her imagination. Ryanne says her own relationship with writing is constantly changing, but that there's one thing she's absolutely certain of, and that is voice is key. She says the best thing that happened during her BFA experience was purifying her relationship with herself, that she knows herself more now than she ever could have hoped to before coming to BG. She says, whether good or bad things, I've recognized and come to terms with all that makes me who I am. Many obstacles have surfaced since discovering myself, but also many opportunities for growth and self-expression, and I have more drive than ever to be absolutely me. Kind of awesome. It is this self-awareness and self-confidence that we hear in the voice of Ryanne's poems, in the minds of her characters. Her advice to future BFAs, there is someone out there who will fall in love with your voice if you give them the opportunity to hear it. Tonight, we have the opportunity to fall in love with Ryanne's. Please, help me welcome Ryanne Duchene.
I'm gonna try and hide the fact that I teared up a little bit there. Thank you. 2 poems tonight and 2 short fiction pieces. And the first piece is a poem about my grandfather. To give a little context, he was an artist. He wrote poems and he painted all sorts of different nature paintings and landscape things. And he worked with foam. Like, he would carve foam things into looking like rocks and animals and all kinds of fantastical creatures. And now they're all over in my house. So I wrote a poem about it. It's called Living in a House Full of Sculptures. Nothing decays as sorely as flesh. Art won't at all. It refuses to die. Lifetimes pass, you remain fresh. Darkest purple swelled to rest in your rotting pockets left behind. Nothing decays as sorely as flesh. Words and paintings survive to impress despairing brethren and squishy minds. Lifetimes pass, you remain fresh. Bodies fade, mornings regress. The colors of death are those we let lie. Nothing decays as sorely as flesh. Art sings things age-old to express the spirits of those who soar in the sky. Lifetimes pass, you remain fresh. Your body is gone, thus I address your art that lives on, a never goodbye. Nothing decays as sorely as flesh. Lifetimes have passed, yet you've never left. I apologize. I had a feeling that would happen reading that poem. That's why I got it out of the way first. The next piece is also a little downer, so that's why it's next. And I'm going to end with some happier stuff, I promise, okay? It's going to end on a good note. My next piece, I don't really have anything to lead into it, so I'm just going to go. It's called Cookie Point. I love how the ocean tickles me to sleep. It's just warm enough to be felt, like blood rushing through throbbing flesh. I massage my fingertips together in the water, hyper aware of the coarse sediments, salt, grit, invisible dead things. This place is peace, I think, staring sightlessly into the deepening swirling sky. See what all I can do with all this peace? I can see the sky. I can feel it, wet and celestial, enveloping and cradling me like a child. I can see the great bear and wonder how heavy she finds me. I can wonder with wide eyes, but I can't move. There are pockets of air building in my spine, stiffening. I want to vomit up the cheap sandwich, sitting fresh in my rocking gut. I want to expel every ounce of my weight and levitate up from this horrid bed. It's digging into my back, pinching my fleshy underarms. How long have I been in bed? I hear gulls and the emphysemic breaths of the ocean crashing into some nearby shore. I love Cookie Point. I love it because Vernon loves coming here. With Maggie. I miss her. That's all. The rocky coast gives in to the tide with crumbly hesitation. Boulders of all shapes, sizes, and rates of erosion pepper the surface, giving the sea plenty of instruments to play her siren song. I go to Cookie by myself, too, whenever Vernon goes to the bar after an argument. But the magic is always darker on those days. It whispers that the solution is to wade out to the furthest possible point, lie on the rocks, under the stars, and let the waves swallow the sadness. I feel brine hardening on my cheeks. A magnetic pull or a taut wire or all-powerful invisible hands keep my arms pinned so I can't wipe it away. But I can wonder with wide eyes, and I can feel my insides buzzing with the same dismal tone of a lost call. The rocks dig deeper into my skin with every pulse of the water rocking me back and forth, back and forth. The enormous sea is climbing up from my hands and arms, covering and uncovering my chest like a hot blanket, overwhelmingly peaceful. Evening approaches on her high tide steed. It's a good time to go back home. He's home now, I think. It's his turn to finally wallow in sorrow. This is a beloved daydream that I visit often. Emotional Vernon post Maggie. I turn to it now, not moving an inch. I can't move. I'll break the door down, face blackened with running mascara, blood congealed in my eyelids, like I do, like he's used to. But this time he'll embrace me and cry. He'll make me tea and cuddle me in bed with Swanee, Maggie's stuffed polar bear that had never felt her delicate touch, snuggled between us, and he'll carefully wash my pain away with cascades of gentle whispers. The stars twinkle as my eyes begin to cloud and I choke on salty snot. I can't move my tongue. Everything feels sick, thick, slimy. I want to vomit. He'll start slowly undressing me, run his hands over every tender dip and mound until he discovers the bottle in my back pocket. He'll recognize it immediately and ask in words sweet yet his, "Why the fuck do you have these, Marilyn? You haven't seen Dr. Arns in 8 months." The plastic presses coldly into my rear thigh, now contorted by my weight and the uneven rocks, and empty aside from seawater. My blood is pure fire. I'm going to throw up. I can't move. He'll stroke my swollen cheek with the back of his twitching, unclenched hand, and with the other he'll despondently massage Swanee's ears between his fingertips, back and forth, back and forth. And he'll realize peace does not come peacefully. It never has. I miss the idea of her. That's all. Back then there was hope. He'll beg me to stop, telling me I don't need them. They're putting me to sleep. They killed our daughter. Was that not enough pain for him to bear? The water feels at once like acid and silence, a destructive truce with my yearning soul. I can almost convince myself that it tastes of liquor. The ocean is so affectionate. "Don't you do this to me," he'll wail, gesturing with the month's worth of tablets that I somehow will not have touched this evening. "You can't leave me alone like that." And I'll snuggle into his chest and whisper, "I'm sorry. I love you." And he'll repeat those very words. He will repeat those very words, somehow, over and over, like a cry through an empty canyon. And he'll rock me back and forth, as I drift asleep in his arms. Yes, that will happen. That will happen. That will never happen. The sky is bruising with darkness, and the waves are sloshing into my slack mouth. It's warm with life and seasoned with death. It tickles my lungs, then sets them ablaze. I need to cough, purge, take off my clothes, heavy with sea and suicide, but I want to sleep, wrapped in Vernon's arms forever, immune to his bitterness if he ever had any. Water crawls into my nostrils, stings the tip of my nose, covers the bruises, and I can't move. The part of me that loves is sovereign, and it wants him, only him, to never leave his gently rocking bed of affection. There among the bears, I drifted to sleep. Okay, on to better things, happier things. This next poem, very, very short. I hope it puts a smile on your face. It's called Oxygen Trip. White mushroom, I sever with a clean claw. I watch, inside, taste sweet air, and turn blue. I smile, a blue smile. What a fun guy. Cool. All right, this is my last piece. I'll just get into it. It's called Uneaten. A sinister morning radiance slithered between my drapes to assault my drowsing eyes with a long, hot kiss. I slowly unfolded my eyelashes. Sleep, my sweet mistress, I bid adieu, to make room for my daily desires, one of them being love for sight of a blood-red sky. Dust particles swirled in the fiery light. Dust always lingered in this dingy place, far too large to be maintained by any number of servants, let alone just 3, all of them too well-mannered to bother with polishing their room heavy with drowsiness. The smells of the wood aging in the rafters and the far-traveling ocean airs tickled my nose. I fought to let these small comforts lull me back to sleep. I rolled to face away from the window and stretched my arm in an arc above my head, careful to let the thick pearly duvet slip away from my chest. Nothing more. I waited like that for several long minutes, annoyed to be awake, and without my cherished one there to soften the echoes bouncing into my room from far off in the morning. These echoes had never seemed so loud before, so ignorant of my feelings. I moaned, projecting my tiny voice. The dark paneled door opposite the window edged open with an impossible soundlessness, and in came my Patty, right on cue, dressed in his lavish tailcoat and the violet tunic with satin stitching that invaded many a dream of mine. With the grace of a snowflake, he drifted to my bedside table where he placed a gleaming breakfast tray piled high with fresh fruits and sweet-smelling pastries. From the serving cart at his heels, he began pouring my usual morning brew from the sleek silver pot into a single Zhuang porcelain teacup, though 2 waited to be filled. Huh? Ah! I pretended to let the sound of falling tea startle me awake and mocked fumbling with the silky bed covers. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Is he looking? I covered myself and stole a glance only to flush hot with frustration. He'd been so preoccupied with the steamy tea that he paid no mind to my indecent exposure. Some Chinese silver needle complemented with a helping of raspberry puff pastries and provisions from the Eastern Garden, my lord. His smooth, sultry voice soothed the ache of being ignored. He lifted the cup and saucer and handed them to me, closing his eyes in avoidance of mine. I didn't receive it from him. I let him stand there, bowed at the hip, impossibly balancing the wiggly drink to a perfect stillness in his portly hands. Nothing upsets or excites you. You're a lovely, elegant brute, I think. I could have held him there forever, suspended in time and space like an unweatherable statue. He would have to move eventually, in anticipation or madness, and I wanted to see the tea jiggle when he lost control. Master, might I suggest at least wearing a light blouse to bed if you find your undone corset too binding? It's October now and bound to be getting colder at night. The tea vibrated ever so gently as he spoke, issued from his mouth, a vague kiss, an intimate exchange of breath, and I snatched the steaming cup from his gloved hands before it could settle. The hot vapors touched my nose, seeped into my mind, and realization blasted through me as though flame had fume. Aha! I knew you saw me, I cried, avoiding the sheet now and throwing it away from my flat masculine chest. You took it all in and didn't let me know of your secret pleasure, you greedy sod. You're so selfish. All this in vain, he spared me not a glance. He did, however, readjust his ovoid glasses and straighten his back. There was nothing to bask in, my lord, but the morning sun. Shall I pick out your daily attire? His words were nettles prodding at my exposed heart. I felt cold suddenly and nodded weakly as I reached for the duvet with one hand. In the other, my tea trembled unabashedly within its vessel. Addie glided across the sea of black marble to the woodwork wardrobe that lay crouched in the shadows. He selected that Gothic brocade dress that collected dust when I walked, the bottom of it no longer elegant navy lace, but drowning tatters. I wore it often, for he often picked it for me. He held it well above the ground as he floated back to me and hovered over my sudden insecurities. I dress you near every day, my lord. I'm blessed enough to see such a virtuous body as yours every time the sun meets the horizon. Piss off. You needed time to think about how to respond. Leave that here and go fetch my boots. I was sure he had seen my tears glinting with the morning fire. They were in the front foyer near the oil hutch. Go! He listened abruptly, and I hated that he did. I hated being so emotional, so uncontrollable, so repulsively young. I needed time to compose myself. It was far too early for such sensitivity. In addition to my morning displeasures, Addie had left me alone with the noxious blue monstrosity. I glared in scorn and trepidation at its withering stitches and patchwork skirt. I know why he chose it. It had sleeves that covered my elbows and a skirt thick enough to fight the gusty ocean air. Either he was disgusted by my body or he wanted to keep it a secret just between us. A lovely daydream that only he could return to. Perhaps he just wanted me to be comfortable in my warmest garment, but that doesn't much help me discern his feelings. And it doesn't change that he stuffs me into this raggedy old towel at least twice a fortnight, enough to be irritated, but not enough that I feel the need to protest and risk upsetting any pleasure he may glean from my wearing it, or helping me put it on. I had dressed myself sometimes before, but I had never donned this increasingly hideous thing on my own, and now that I had made my bed, I didn't want to sleep in it. I slowly rested myself from my spacious silken bed and stood for a moment in indecision, half roused and hapless. The sky held tight to its foreboding coppery hue, and its light beckoned me closer to the window rather than any dress. I sauntered around my bed and tore the massive curtains completely away from each other. The light bathed every surface and every pore of my prodigious chamber, even the far corner where the wardrobe lay hutched and frigid. The reflective floor became a sea of lava, the white marbly veins hot and shining. The child in me said to dance on it, and the blooming adult wondered what the burns would feel like. Everything glowed with a glorious holy hotness, and I paused a while to bask in it because it obviously wanted to be basked in. Looking out, it was evident that a dreadful storm was brewing. Black clouds were making electric love with the sea in the west. On the bay, I could see a few large brigs and some sailboats bobbing rhythmically, their sails billowing in the gale that kept the whirling gulls aloft. It was positively transfixing indeed. What intrigue does an image like this have that I don't seem to understand? The sound of heels clacking against marble spun me away from my thoughts. Addie had entered silently and dropped my knee-high boots. He didn't come any closer to me than the far side of the bed, but he watched me intently, his golden brown eyes mere slits in the darkening light. Perhaps heavy with the thoughts of suddenly, dirty dog, I've caught you in such a vulgar state of mind, and it tickles me so. But worry not, we are vulgar together. You asked me to leave so you could stare from your window? He questioned condescendingly. You did as I asked. Now leave me be. You made it clear you wish not to see me like this. I whipped my satin bangs out of my eyes as I turned back to the encroaching storm, trying to balance my mind between reality and wishful thinking. Dramatic acts would carry no weight, but my lust was obvious. He had to think that my feelings were genuine and not a fit of teenage passion. I knew that he was capable of moving without sound. Checking to see if he had obeyed my order, I was pleasantly upset to find that he had not. In fact, I caught him staring, and the euphoria threatened to knock out my knees and make my face explode. I hoped that the flood of sunlight past my face was a thick enough veil to hide my peeping at his crotch. As far as I could tell, his situation did not mirror mine. I began to wonder if he would do as he was told, getting more excited at the thought of getting to scold him with a vehement slap across the face. I remained where I was, terrified at the thought of further rejection should he see my front half of him. I was saved from my inactive festering by the manor's most matronly maid, Miss Rainier, wandering in and humbly requesting Addie's assistance with lighting the sconces in the corridor. How humorously and ceremoniously short she was. Addie snapped his attention away from me instantly and walked it away with Miss Rainier's candelabra, leaving me wondering if it was even me that he had been transfixed by, or if it had been the intimidating color of the dawn. I let nature caress the weight of my free-hanging body as I danced away from the window, unwilling now to wear anything that might contain me, and took in the dazzling beauty that embellished my chamber. My portrait above the threshold featured myself in my most glorious emerald gown, smirking down at the world from a gleaming golden frame. Luminous crystals and polished stones were scattered across the few wooden surfaces, collecting sunshine. The untouched books on the towering blackwood bookshelf shone with a classiness that I had yet to grow into. My life was rather dreamy. I frolicked over to my littered vanity and hazily slid each emerald-encrusted ring that I could spot onto my slender fingers, wiggling them daintily like I had seen the women folk in the villages do. I kept my marriage finger empty and imagined how heavy that ring would feel one day, holding all of my precious Addie's love inside. With hands laden in gold and vibrant gems, I made my way to my wardrobe and ran a weighty finger along the woodland images etched into it for a moment, appreciating every beautiful shadow painted by the faded light. I wrenched open the doors. Nothing spectacular, nothing that would attract Addie's attention more than the nasty disaster draped unfittingly over my lustrous bedspread. I considered my current attire, fleshy and raw, and thought of nothing more appropriate to wear in my loud and desperate condition. I wanted Addie to see me, without even the safety of cloth to defer to. I pranced buoyantly over to my boots and pulled the black mesh stockings resting inside them up to the tops of my thighs before stepping resolutely into them, tying the laces into a thick bow just under the blush of my knees. Though lacking a crown, the person in the mirror was nothing short of royal and voluptuous. Addie would fall to his knees in reverence despite his cultured disposition. Ready or not, I'm coming for you. Faraway rumbling accompanied me as I sashayed into the corridor, extremely cold and elated, and I knew that the clouds were flashing violently there with the Lord's furious pronouncement of my impiety. "Oh, young Lord Baxter, you've no clothes!" cried Miss Rainier from mere meters away. Addie stood at her elbow with a disturbing scowl plastered on his refined features. He lowered his head so that his glasses slipped below his nose bridge, which for once he seemed not to notice. I stepped closer and felt the growing proximity crushing my sensual spirit. He was not happy in the least, and I futilely fought back the tears welling up again under my eyes. He hated me. I hated me. "Find some clothes for the master. I done seen his unseeables. Yes, I did." Miss Rainier went calling for her fellow servants in blind fit, and left me alone in the vast hallway with my beloved butler. Even from a distance, he towered over me, and the heat of his anger blew him into a giant. If one of us was going to succumb to their needs, I realized it was going to be me. The clicks of my heels resonated slower and slower, and my confidence dissipated completely with the ear-splitting clatter of a ring falling off of my tiny thumb, made larger with another ominous thunderclap. The golden dawn had officially given way to disaster. Addie breathed heavily enough to expel 2 of the 3 delicate flames he held. Did I do that? From here? Can you feel my breath from here? I clicked forward once, twice, 3 times. Oh, Adiyama, only one may look upon this supple temple, then it must be only you. Why don't you revel in it? Addie was positively steaming. I had crossed the line. It was my job to prevent this, my lord. He growled through his teeth. You have disgraced more than yourself. My reputation shattered by you over and over. He strode towards me intensely, and with his movement he swept away every last insubstantial flame that had been slicing through the impregnable blackness. In that moment, I was pitifully aware of my body, and I realized that I hadn't touched my breakfast. I imagined my pastries without warmth, my tea without steam, and I imagined them black and bitter. The last thing I was erect. I could not say the same for the brute. He was miles long, at least. He became the storm itself, mighty and fearsome Zeus. I can still hear his rage boiling in the dark waters over my head. I find myself swimming and flailing, dissolving in his black, torturous song. I wish I could close the curtains all the way.
I'm in charge. Am I in charge? Because you spilled the drink on me because of me.
No, I trust you to make sure we're not all gonna slip on ice. All right, well, Jess is masterfully taking care of that problem. Thanks, Jess. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce our 3rd and final reader, Rita Johnson, a novelist, technical writer, and I recently learned an avid chef of vegan Korean food. I don't know, ask her about kimchi. Rita's writing requires hours of researching people, places, and depending on the genre, historical events. She tells me that she enjoys this part of the writing process because it helps her focus on the details and be true to the story she most wants to tell. It also helps her create backstories for her characters. While historical fiction is her favorite genre of books and TV shows, tonight you'll hear about a dystopia in which a company called Movio has created a device allowing people to discard individual emotions. Main character Monica must come to terms with her own trauma in the face of others' addiction to the device. When I asked Rita about her favorite BFA experience, she said it was working one-on-one with the faculty in the department and being part of a program that supports her creative needs. She writes, "The one-on-one mentoring is something I will always look back fondly on." Please join me in welcoming our final reader of the season, Rito Johnson.
Hello. So as Abby said, I'm Rita. It's nice to meet everyone. I'll be reading a portion of the first chapter of Muvio. Incoming call from Sakura. Accept or decline. A soft, non-robotic female voice startles me as I walk to work. I jump slightly, narrowly avoid bumping into the people around me. Beyond the sounds of high heels and dress shoes on the pavement and the soft whispers of people answering calls, city center is quiet. Watch it. An oncoming woman in a red dress snaps, breaking the soft melody of quiet voices and shoe clicks. Several people, even those across the street, look in my direction. I flush the color of her dress. People can spot a tech newbie from a mile away. Sorry. I dip my head in apology and cling to the edge of the sidewalk to make sure I don't get in anyone's way. Accept or decline, the voice prompts again. Accept, I murmur, barely moving my lips, only loud enough for the microphone to pick up my voice. It's almost a week since I ditched my old smartphone for good and switched to Claris, a lightweight, smart pair of glasses that can do practically everything. Connecting, Claris responds. I fight the urge to thank Claris for her help as I adjust how the thin gray frame rests on the bridge of my nose. A small icon appears on the left lens, which acts like a screen only I can see. But of course, anyone can see the glasses on my face and watch as I awkwardly learn how to use the smart assistant. Claris is truly a genius piece of technology when she isn't scaring the shit out of me by randomly alerting me of a notification. Monica, Sakura, my best friend, practically sings my name. Heading to work? Yep. I try to match Sakura's cheerful manner. Immediately, I regret how the word slides out of my mouth. I glance up at the sky and hope that Sakura won't ask why I'm so lively for only 8:30 a.m. She knows I'm never that cheery in the morning. I let out a slow breath so Claris's microphone won't pick it up. Gray clouds embrace the top of glass and steel skyscrapers. Sunlight struggles to break through the thick clouds. Typically, by this time of the morning, a thin layer of sweat forms on my skin during my walk to work, but today the clouds bring lower temperatures. I wrap my tissue-thin purple rain jacket tight around my body as a gust of wind blows, funneled between the buildings. It may only be in the low 80s, but after stretches of over 100 degrees in city center, it feels chilly. I say a silent prayer that I don't get caught in a brewing rainstorm without an umbrella. At least I remember to grab a jacket. Knowing Transo's weather, it'll be sunny by noon. Want to grab dinner? Been a while, I say, rushing to get the words out. I take my eyes off the sky and narrowly avoid bumping into another person. Their look of disgust tells me they must think I'm drunk from the way I'm acting, stumbling around to avoid getting in people's way and looking everywhere but where I'm going. If it weren't for Claris, everyone would think I'm talking to myself. I want to dart into an alley and let the panic subside before I get to work, but I don't have time. Breathe, Monica, breathe, Sakura says. I hate that she says this. I'm usually better at hiding when I'm on edge, but I'm still shaken up by the nightmare that's terrorized me every night this week. I want to rip Claris off my face and start this conversation all over again. I'd love to, babe, but can't, Sakura says. I picture her pouting. As I approach a crowd of people, Claris slowly turns up the volume so I can hear her better. Swamped. I'm practically living in my office right now. Thank God I have an actual office and not a pod. She pauses to take a sip of something, probably her third cup of coffee. During our years at City Center University, Sakura insisted that every final exam needed 4 cups of coffee. I was never quite sure if it was truly her secret weapon. If I consumed that much caffeine, my heart would stop. An intern caught me nodding off yesterday, mortified, babe, mortified. And to think I want to be promoted to junior partner in a few years, I must be out of my mind. Ah yes, the crash after the high. I bite back a laugh, remembering Sakura passed out in the lecture hall after an exam, too tired to walk back to the dorm. You need quality sleep. Can't function on 4 hours forever. Maybe cut back on the caffeine? I stare at the ground as I fight through a crowd of people, dressed head to toe in formal business attire, and past the entrance to City Center's main subway station. Everyone must be grateful for the cloud cover. I can't imagine wearing that many layers during the heat of the day, but at least their offices have air conditioning. Most days, I walk to work in my house instead of taking the subway. I stand out enough as it is in my regular clothes, woven twill pants, and a recycled cotton t-shirt, all smelling faintly of stale animal poop after a long day as an animal care specialist at City Center Exotic Animal Sanctuary. Even though animal caretakers are a highly respected profession, we certainly aren't treated as such. 2 cups, she slurps. It's progress. Oh, Clarice lowers the volume momentarily. You can't tell anyone this. Clarice, private note, I murmur, so the conversation can't be recorded. My law firm is going to be acquired by a movie corporation. It hasn't been released yet. Exciting, I say, raising the pitch of my voice to match Sakura's enthusiasm. How did it happen? The partners have a strong relationship with people at a movie corp, Sakura says. I stay silent as if I'm formulating another question, but Sakura already anticipates it. Confidential and confidential. Anyways, I gotta ask a favor. As long as you're not asking me to babysit your niece again, ask away, I tease, feeling myself begin to calm down. Remember what happened last time? Thought I was gonna lose all my hair when the vacuum went on. She's 4, Monica. It's not like she turned the vacuum on and held you down. But she still laughed. I shake my head. You're lucky I didn't go bald. You'd still look good even if you were bald, Sakura says. Anyway, you know how your job makes you ungodly happy? I'm about to respond when I lock eyes with a middle-aged man dressed in an all-black suit who's walking toward me, stony-faced. I can't help feeling like he's staring at me, and I swallow hard. Before giving it a second thought, I run across the street to the other side without looking. A few elders pause and look both ways before they cross, a habit of the past when cars were prevalent. Watching them cross carefully as if a car could hit them at any moment reminds me of my grandpa. When I was young, he'd always hold my hand while crossing the street so he could yank me away from potential danger. Grandpa grew up towards the end of electric cars. Everyone knew electricity was way cheaper than gas. The Republic of Integrated Commonwealth outlawed electric cars shortly after the end of the Great War, when the batteries mysteriously combusted, sometimes killing the passengers while the car was in motion. Kind of like self-driving cars. They were outlawed after discovering car security panels could be hacked and rammed into pedestrians. Everything and everyone in the Republic is safer without cars. Seeing gas-powered cars in city center is rare. Only government officials and some corporations have the luxury of affording fuel. Sakura says my name, and I force myself to respond. Yep. I swallow hard and hope that Sakura can't sense the panic that ran through me a moment ago. Forcing myself to push my fear away and muster a small smile as I think about work. As an animal care specialist, it's my job to feed the exotic birds, clean their enclosures, and scoop their food. Even if it isn't as glamorous as working in an office, work is the one place where I can truly be happy. What about it? You know that one guy you dated broke up with you because he claimed you were too happy all the time? Sakura clears her throat. I hear the scattering of papers in the background. I mean, he's not entirely wrong then, but you get what I'm saying? Yes, I force myself to say. I never told Sakura that the guy dumped me because he couldn't handle my nightmare. I wince and recall the stinging nightmares. God, Monica, just shut up already. I never get any sleep when I stay over because of your nightmare. If the favor involves him, don't ask. Not going to happen, I say. Sorry, I quickly added to reduce the sharpness of my words. I walk past the entrance to City Center Park. My eyes linger on the large oak tree planted in the center of the small green space. My feet propel me toward the sanctuary as I notice the scrolling advertisements covering the building demand my attention. Get rid of unwanted emotions now, and Amuvio, power to change and save lives. Years ago, these ads would have made me scoff. Amuvio Corporation had created a new technology called Amuvio that had the ability to extract an emotion from your head and ship it off in a glass canister. No, Monica, capital N, capital O, I would never do that to you. Sakura's voice startles me. It's urgent and serious. I love you, Em, so I'm making it crystal clear. Please do not lose your shit on me. Appreciate it, I say. So what's the favor? Sakura doesn't say anything, and for a second, I'm worried that one of us has accidentally hung up. Sakura, I say, drawing out her name. It's not like her to be indirect. That's what works about our friendship. She's direct, I keep secrets and pretend that everything's fine. Together, it balances out. I need your happiness, she blurts out. I freeze, too surprised to respond. Huh? I say, choking on my words. I tell Clarice to turn up the volume. Em, did you hear me? She says. I slowly start walking again, wondering if I heard her correctly. Your happiness, babe. I need it. Can you give me some? Thank you.
Another round of applause for all the readers.
Finals next week, everyone.